So as I said, these cuttings do show that COVID really did change science in terms of how it was done. And of course, we needed answers very quickly. And trials were absolutely fundamental in terms of producing the evidence. And we needed that evidence very quickly. And there's one trial in particular called Recovery that was set up by scientists based in Oxford. And it was described as a simple trial, although I guess you could argue there was nothing really very simple about it. But the trial did get set up very quickly. There was dramatic reduced bureaucracy in terms of ethical approval being granted very quickly, which I'll show on the next slide. And recruitment was really rapid. I mean, it really takes your breath away as to how quickly this trial was set up, certainly in my experience. And the reason why Recovery was called a simple trial was simply because people were randomized to one of two treatments. You either got one thing or another thing. You got the treatment that they were interested in investigating versus the normal treatment or standard of care. And they had one very clear, definitive outcome. Did people die or not? It was as simple as that. Did you die or did you live? As I said, I still really stand in awe of this trial. The trial protocol was drafted on the 10th of March, and the first patient was recruited 9 days later. I mean, that's just unheard of within clinical science. They were testing treatments like dexamethasone, hydroxychloroquine, of course, which President Trump was very enthusiastic about. And again, the numbers coming through these trials were just phenomenal. Nearly 50,000 participants, 200 active sites, and they did get the rapid answers that they needed, and they got them quickly. In that, importantly, dexamethasone saved lives. So it was really quite phenomenal. But of course, as I said, the issue about this trial was that they had a very clear, definitive outcome. Did people die or not? So that really is the basis for what I want to talk about. What outcomes should we measure in trials? Particularly trials that may not necessarily be described as simple, or where you're only dealing with one of two treatments. And very often the kind of work that I do, I'm not dealing with just one or two treatments. It's more complicated than that. So if we think a little bit about outcomes, why are they important? Well, they allow us to decide if an intervention, an approach, a treatment, a new way of doing something is effective. So going back to Recovery trial as an example, did more people die using one drug versus another? That was basically the outcome that they were interested in. So outcomes are important to tell us or help us decide if an intervention is effective. And they're also important as well when it comes to synthesizing evidence from lots of different trials. And very often, if people are carrying out systematic reviews or meta-analysis where you're doing all of this synthesis, you will pool outcomes from similar trials. You'll look at trials focusing on the same type of intervention or very similar interventions. Some of those trials might be positive, some might be negative, and so some may show no effect. So you're pulling all of the information together to find out what works or what doesn't work. And that's one of the strengths of systematic reviews and meta-analysis. But there are difficulties when trials are examining similar interventions, but using different outcomes and different outcome measurements. And just as an example, looking at medication review, one systematic review identified 327 different outcomes being used across 47 different trials. So everybody was looking at slightly different things or very different things, which makes pulling all of that information together really very difficult, and then coming up with a definitive answer in terms of what works or what doesn't work. So there is a huge spectrum of outcomes currently being used across very similar trials, and that leads to some of these difficulties that I've just described. So what then should we measure when we're doing trials? An initiative called COMET has been set up, being led by Professor Paula Williamson, who is based at the University of Liverpool, and COMET stands for Core Outcome Measures in Effectiveness Trials. And what COMET seeks to do is to promote the use of what are known as core outcome sets or COSs. And a core outcome set is a minimum set of outcomes to be measured in all trials conducted in a particular area of healthcare. So if you're interested in interventions that are focusing on, for example, medication review, all trials should be using a similar or equivalent set of outcomes. So a COS is really about what we should be measuring in trials focusing on the same topic. This is a stepwise guide in terms of how to go about developing a course. And I appreciate for those of you who might be looking at this on a laptop, this is probably not terribly clear, but I'll pull out the steps a little bit later on in the presentation. But it is very systematic and it is very clear exactly the way in which you should approach the development of a core outcome set. So what I want to focus on really, I guess, as a case study are what outcomes should we measure in trials that focus on improving the use of medicines in older people living with dementia. As I mentioned at the start of the presentation, I have a particular interest in medicines use in older people. And of course, people living with dementia will be on a number of medicines and will have very specific needs and requirements when it comes to the use of medicines because particularly of cognitive decline. So as I've said, I've had a long-standing interest in this area, and a number of years ago, we were awarded a 3-year grant to develop a new intervention or approach that would focus on how to improve medicines management in people living with dementia within their own homes or within primary care. We were going to develop this intervention and then test it out in a feasibility study. And one of the things that we started to think about quite early on in that grant was, okay, if we're going to do a feasibility study, what outcomes should we measure? What should we be looking at in terms of outcomes? And we therefore decided as part of this overall grant to develop a core outcome set. Again, I'm going to go back to this slide that has been taken from the COMET initiative that outlines the various steps that you should follow when you do develop a core outcome set. But as I said, I can appreciate that that might be a little bit difficult to see for people. So these are the key steps that should be followed. Step number 1 is to define the scope of the course, and I'll explain what I mean by that in a minute. Step 2 is to check if a course is in fact needed or is somebody already doing one, and if not, that cost then should be registered on the COMET website, indicating that you or a group of individuals will be developing a core outcome set. You then need to develop a protocol or a very detailed methodology outlining exactly how you're going to develop the core outcome set. Then you need to determine what you're going to measure, and then finally how you are going to measure those outcomes. So those are the steps that are entailed within that schematic that I've already shown. So again, going back to our project in terms of the scope, so we decided from the outset that the core outcome set would be applicable to interventions that assess any or all aspects of medicines management in people living with dementia residing in primary care, including residents of care homes with or without nursing. And we gave a definition of what we meant in relation to medicines management, and it was fairly all-encompassing. It was going to be about prescribing, dispensing of medication, adherence to medication, and review of medication. We decided from the outset that we were not interested in this cost being applicable, for example, for people living with dementia who might be in hospital for a period of time and who again might be subjected to certain types of interventions. But we were not interested in a hospital setting for the application of this particular core outcome set. So that's what I mean by the scope. Where really is this core outcome set going to be applicable to in relation to future studies? Step 2, we checked on the COMET database, which is a very useful resource in terms of finding out what core outcome sets are being developed or have been developed. And there were no similar core outcome sets either developed in the past or in the process of being developed. So therefore, we completed a registration form indicating that we were going to be doing this piece of work. And the screenshot on the right-hand side of the slide just shows you the entry for our core outcome set. Step number 3 then involved us developing this protocol or very detailed method in terms of guiding our approach to the core outcome set development in terms of what we wanted or what we were hoping the core outcome set would tell us in terms of what we should measure. So those were steps 2 and 3. Moving on then to step 4, and this was all contained within our detailed methodology. Step 4 is divided into a number of different elements, and step 4.1, for the want of a better way of describing it, was really about identifying what's already out there in terms of what outcomes are currently being used in trials. And we undertook a systematic review to identify outcomes being used in trials that had already taken place that were assessing the effectiveness of medicines management interventions for people living with dementia. The searches were conducted back in February 2016. That's how long ago this study was actually done. And we found 5 trials that met our inclusion criteria that were then included in our systematic review. And these trials used a number of outcomes that we identified and compiled in a list, and I'll come back to that in a minute. And again, I'm showing you here the screenshot of the systematic review that was published a couple of years ago, outlining the way in which we did the review and what we found. So that's what was already known and out there in the literature. The second thing that we did then was to also ask what we would describe as really interested or key stakeholders, what they thought should be measured in trials in this particular population. And we undertook a series of interviews with people living with dementia, their carers, general practitioners and community pharmacists, all of whom would have a vested interest in medicines. And we asked them which outcomes they would consider to be important in future research examining this particular type of intervention. And we published a paper that outlined the patient and the carer views, and then also a separate paper for the GPs and community pharmacists. So we had information from our systematic reviews about outcomes already been used in trials, and then we asked these key group of stakeholders what they thought should be measured. So we pulled together a draft list of outcomes from these 2 sources, and it came to 49 in total. And we reviewed those 49 outcomes, and we were really checking as to whether or not some of those outcomes in some way were duplicated, whether or not they would be irrelevant, or whether or not they were outside the scope of what we wanted to do in the development of this core outcome set. And we whittled it down to 33. And we grouped those 33 outcomes into a classification system that has been developed by one of the review groups as part of the Cochrane collaboration, which I'm sure you're aware of is responsible for producing very definitive systematic reviews. And the outcomes fell into these broad categories listed here. So we had medication-related outcomes, patient-related outcomes, use and access to services. So that would be, for example, whether or not they could get to see a GP promptly, see their consultant promptly. Resource use was really about cost effectiveness. Social outcomes was around caregiver burden, so the amount of burden that people who had responsibilities for caring for those with dementia. Adverse effects or harms, and then knowledge and satisfaction. So the 33 outcomes were covered within these 7 broad classifications. The next thing we did then was to undertake what is known as a Delphi consensus exercise. And this is really just a way to achieve agreement amongst a range of different stakeholders. And it consists of presenting information, usually in the form of statements or questions. And where we ask participants or people who take part in this type of exercise to rate the importance of the information. The statements or questions very often will be presented a number of times in sequence, or what are known as rounds. So you will have perhaps round 1, round 2, and round 3, where people again are assessing the importance of the information. And the findings from a previous round will normally be presented in the next round. So what people have indicated in round 1 will be presented to participants in round 2, and so on. And these types of exercises can either be done online or they can be done face-to-face. Increasingly, they are now being done online. There's really quite sophisticated software that allows you to do this. So when we carried out our Delphi consensus exercise, we involved researchers who were interested in this type of topic. We involved healthcare professionals, so again, GPs, community pharmacists, anybody providing care to people with dementia, and also advocates for older people. So those, for example, who would be members of charities such as Age UK and the Alzheimer's Society. We ran 3 rounds in sequence of questionnaires that were accessed through a web link. And these questionnaires contained the 33 outcomes that we had compiled from our systematic review and from our interviews, and they were grouped into these classification categories. And I'll show you an example of what this looked like in a minute. And we sent the questionnaire, or we made the questionnaire available on 3 occasions, November 2016 and January and March of 2017. When the first round questionnaire was distributed, participants could also suggest other outcomes that they felt had not been included as part of that 33. And group and individual feedback and responses were also given to participants in round 2 and round 3. So what people had agreed or commented on in round 1 was presented to people in round 2, and what they agreed and commented on in round 2 was presented back to people in round 3. Everything was anonymous. You could not have been identified as a result of taking part in this, so nobody knew who had said what or had responded in a particular way. So this is just, again, a screenshot allowing you to see what the first page of the questionnaire looked like on screen. We gave a little bit of an introduction, and then we presented some of these outcomes just here, and then we would have given people a definition of what that outcome actually meant, and they had to rate the importance on this particular scale that ran from 0 up to 9, and I'll give you an explanation as to what the various scores meant. So they were asked to rate each outcome on a 9-point scale, and this is very commonly used in these types of Delphi exercises. So if you rated an outcome between 1 and 3, that indicated that you thought it was of limited importance. 4 to 6 meant that it was important or not critical. And 7 to 9, it was considered to be critically important. So we were looking at the scores coming back from the participants in this particular exercise. And an outcome was eligible to be included in the core outcome set if 70% or more of participants rated it as critical, and fewer than 15% of participants rated it as limited importance. And we were looking at those overall percentages of people indicating their agreement or otherwise around importance after round 2 and after round 3. So what did we find? We found, sorry, I'm just going to go back one. So these are the results of in terms of the participants. We invited 114 to take part. 52 completed the consent form and enrolled, suggesting that they were going to continue with the study. But when it came to the completion of round 1, we had a little bit of a dropout. So it went down to 48 completing the first round questionnaire, 47 completed the second round questionnaire, and 44 completed the third round questionnaire. We did have a range of participants from a number of different countries. So we had Europeans, Australia, New Zealand, also the States, but predominantly from the UK, and also from a range of backgrounds as well. In terms of the consensus, 21 outcomes met the threshold for inclusion in the course. So that meant that more than 70% of those who took part in this study were agreeing that 21 outcomes were critically important. 21 represents a huge number of outcomes to include in any one single study, and we felt that a core outcome set containing 21 outcomes was really not going to be feasible. So we looked at the percentage of agreement across those outcomes, and in the end we selected the 7 highest ranked outcomes to include in the core outcome set. So that was based on the percentage of those rating outcomes as critical. So in some cases we had perhaps 96% of people agreeing that something was critical, and we just worked our way down until we stopped at 7. And the reason why we stopped at 7 was that that is consistent with the median number of outcomes that generally are reported in Cochrane systematic reviews. There's really very little guidance about this as to how many outcomes should be included in a core outcome set. So looking at Cochrane reviews was one way of doing it. And you can see the list that we decided upon in terms of outcomes for this core outcome set on the right-hand side of the slide. So medication side effects, adverse drug events, medication appropriateness, falls, behavioural psychological symptoms of dementia, acceptability of an intervention to patients, carers, stakeholders, and quality of life. So if we were to go on and do a trial looking at medicines management in people living with dementia, these would be the recommended outcomes that should be measured as part of that trial and any other similar trial. I suppose a couple of comments about this core outcome set. it obviously covers a range of different areas or domains, but with obviously a very strong focus on medicines, which is not surprising because the nature of the interventions would be focusing on medicines. I think from a strength point of view in terms of the work, it was, I think, pretty sound from a methods point of view. And as you saw, once people agreed to take part and answered that first questionnaire, very few people dropped out. So we were able to retain people within the study. But I think it did have a number of limitations. Number one being that in the initial outset, we had 21 outcomes. And a core outcome set is meant to be a minimum set of outcomes that you would measure. 21 by any stretch of the imagination is not minimum. So I think it did present a problem. And we then had to whittle it down a little bit further. The other issue was that we found it impossible to recruit patients and carers to the Delphi panel that completed that questionnaire. And that is probably not entirely surprising, particularly if you consider people living with dementia may have found some difficulty in answering a questionnaire of that nature. I think core outcome sets can seem a little bit obscure and perhaps a little bit difficult to explain. Having said that, we here at Queen's have developed a number of other core outcome sets across a number of different topic areas, and we've always struggled to involve patients and indeed carers as part of the Delphi panel. And I think it's something that core outcome set developers do struggle with generally. And I think it also means as well that perhaps those core outcome sets may not necessarily be directly relevant to patients and carers and other stakeholders who do not participate for whatever reason. The other thing to bear in mind as well about this particular core outcome set is that we did not undertake step 5, which is part of the overall development process, or rather a later step 4. And the later step 4 indicates that when you've done all of this work, the final thing that you should do in confirming these outcomes is to have a face-to-face meeting, again with a range of stakeholders, and ask them to comment on the outcomes that have been agreed following the Delphi questionnaire. And this is an opportunity to refine it further and to reach final agreement on the content of the core outcome set. We didn't do that. We didn't really have the resources to do it. I think nowadays, increasingly, people are doing that step by having a face-to-face meeting to again, just finalise things. And increasingly, that is something that we ourselves here at Queen's are beginning to do. But when we did this particular project, we didn't do it. And again, I've just highlighted the paper that came from this particular piece of work that does outline how we develop the core outcome set and what it does include. Going back to this schematic again, I sort of almost preempted myself by talking about step 5. And that is something, again, as part of this work that we didn't do. And the core outcome set is about what to measure. One of the criticisms of core outcome sets is that they're great. It tells us what we should be measuring, but what it doesn't do is tell us how to measure those outcomes. And that is what step 5 is all about. And step 5 has been influenced by another abbreviation called COSMIN, and COSMIN stands for Consensus-Based Standards for the Selection of Health Measurement Instruments. And this is really about improving the selection of outcome measurement instruments of health outcomes. So how do you measure health-related quality of life? How do you measure medication appropriateness? And again, we didn't do that as part of this particular COS project, but again, it's something that we're doing in some ongoing projects that we currently have taking place at Queen's at the minute. I suppose the last comment I would make as well is that there is huge enthusiasm for certainly the development of core outcome sets. And if you go onto the COMET website and look at the database, you'll see the number of core outcome sets that have been developed. But what is proving, I think, to be a little bit of a challenge and a bit of a struggle for people is actually using core outcome sets in intervention studies. It's beginning to happen, but it's happening very, very slowly. And I think there are a number of reasons for that. Certainly, if we're planning some kind of intervention study or trial and we have a core outcome set or we've developed a core outcome set, the plan would be that it should be used. And increasingly, funders of research are now expecting to see some reference to core outcome sets if somebody is proposing a trial and a grant application and there is a core outcome set available, that core outcome set should be used. So it's been, I think, a bit of a struggle to get them into operational use, but we are getting there. So just to finish off, I'd like to thank Heather Barry and Mairead McGrattan, who were really intimately involved in the project and the work that I've just described, all of the collaborators and the participants, and of course the funders for this particular work, which was R&D, Atlantic Philanthropies and the Department for the Economy, who funded a studentship for Mairead McGrattan. So thank you very much indeed for listening.